my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned for Roger's Random Book Show. Yes, it is the return of Roger's Random Book Show. It's been a couple weeks since we did this. I've been too busy to do Roger's Random Book Show, which is tragic. We can't have that go on any longer. The show must go on. So, Roger's Random Book Show is the show where Roger and I just wander around the manor and pick up some random books, and then we talk about them. One of these books isn't so random, but it's actually, today is mostly fantasy, sword and sorcery stuff, some science fiction stuff. Stuff like that. So let's talk about it, Roger. The first thing that I have to talk about today on Roger's Random Book Show is something to correct a mistake I made when I made a video a little while back. I made a video called Every Edgar Rice Burroughs Book I Own. And I forgot to show one of the books that I own that is Edgar Rice Burroughs. And that is this book right here. Actually, I have a couple books that are the same book, but this is the one I forgot to mention. This is The Land That Time Forgot. This is the commemorative edition. Has an introduction by Mike Resnick. And this is one of the Edgar Rice Burroughs books that was published by University of Nebraska Press. Probably a while ago now. When were these printed? Because there were a whole series of these. Okay, this was printed in 1999. And it is a reprint from the 1924 edition by Grosset and Dunlap. So it is a direct facsimile, actually, of the 1924 edition. And I know that because I've got the 1924 edition. So, I was able to compare. There are some slight differences between this and the 1924 edition. If you look at the title page, it's almost the same. Although, in the 1924 edition, it's the same title page, only this little design is missing. And of course, you have a different publisher, so that was whited out. That was whited out. And those were replaced by a couple different things. First, it has the introduction to the Bison Books edition by Mike Resnick. That was changed. University of Nebraska Press was put down there. Otherwise, it's exactly the same as a title page to the 1924 edition. And you do have that introduction, which is new from Mike Resnick. And I think the best thing about this reprint, though, is it does have something that the 1924 edition didn't have, and that was this map. The 24 edition does not have this map, which is a map of the island of Casbah, the land that time forgot. And this map was drawn by Edgar Rice Burroughs, I believe. Yeah, drawn by Edgar Rice Burroughs in 1917. So that makes this really awesome. Otherwise, it is the exact same book. It's just basically a duplicate of this edition. Right down to the illustrations and everything. Everything else looks exactly the same. So that was pretty cool. Has that same illustration there is in the University of Nebraska Press. And this book is excellent. It's very often considered to be Edgar Rice Burroughs' best science fiction book, although you have others that will say that the Moon Maid trilogy is actually the best. If I had to decide, the Moon Maid might have been a little bit more interesting in that the three parts of the story, it's a three-part story. They both are. This is a three-part story as well. Both of these books were published as multiple books in paperback. But the parts in the Moon Maid were all different from each other in some interesting ways that I think kind of makes it probably a little bit better as far as the story that's being told, as far as the science fiction elements. But this is a great book. So they're neck and neck as far as I'm concerned. The Land That Time Forgot is definitely one of my favorite Edgar Rice Burroughs stories. It's fantastic. And I'm really surprised that I forgot to mention this particular edition. Or this one. I also have another hardback that's not the 1924 edition, which looks a little better than this one, that I also have. And I did remember to show that one. But I forgot to show this one, so I had to correct that. So now you've seen all my Edgar Rice Burroughs books. Probably. Now let's move on to just some other random books. But Edgar Rice Burroughs was on my mind. So I picked up a book from my random books from an author who is not nearly as good as Edgar Rice Burroughs, but who really, really liked Edgar Rice Burroughs, and that would be Lin Carter. Lin Carter liked to write books that were, let's say, in the tradition of other writers' books, usually Edgar Rice Burroughs or Robert E. Howard. Infamously, Lin Carter is one of the people that wrote Conan stories, Conan pastiche stories that were included among Conan stories in the Old Lancer series of books. He was hired by L. Sprague de Camp to do that. But he also wrote a bunch of stuff on his own. And probably my favorite thing that I've read from Lin Carter is probably his Callisto books, which was a series of pastiches, basically, of the Mars series from Edgar Rice Burroughs. It doesn't take place on Mars, it takes place on Callisto. But they are so much like Edgar Rice Burroughs' Mars series that they are basically a pastiche or a ripoff, if you want to say that. It very much in the tradition of Edgar Rice Burroughs, and that was clearly the case. He wasn't trying to hide this. And the Callisto books, of all the Lin Carter books that I've read, and I've read quite a few, the Callisto books are my favorite. I was surprised to see them be reprinted, and only a couple were, from what I remember. So this edition was put out by iBooks. iBooks put out this, and I'm not sure if iBooks is still around. But this was published when? In 2000? It was probably published, yeah. So this was published in 2000, which was a while ago now, 25 years. My goodness. So this was published. I still think of this as like the new edition of Callisto, but it's old. And it has this beautiful Steranko cover on it, which is not original to this volume. That actually is a cover to a Lee Brackett book, I believe. I'm almost certain that's where I've seen this cover before. I think I have this cover on one of Lee Brackett's books. But it was recycled for this edition of Callisto. And there were, I think, 5 or 6 books in the Callisto series. I can't remember. But this reprints the first 2 of them. So this book has, let me see if it has, does it even have, yeah, it has Jandar of Callisto, and it has Black Legion of Callisto. Jandar of Callisto and Black Legion of Callisto. It also has a little map, a very basic map that is, sort of useless. It's so basic, but there you have it. And this is trashy and not very good, but fun. I remember this as being pretty fun. The part of John Carter, the character who is John Carter, is a soldier from Vietnam who finds a way to transport himself to Callisto. As it says on the back of this, at the height of the Vietnam War, John Dark, his name is John Dark, is a helicopter pilot for the International Red Cross, flying numerous rescue missions until the day his helicopter crashes in the Cambodian jungle. Cut off from American troops, he searches for a way out, only to find a lost city and a gateway to another world. Yeah. And so he arrives in Callisto, where it's turns into, an imitation Edgar Rice Burroughs book. But like I said, it's not great, but it's fun. The Callisto books after these two started to get progressively more terrible, from what I remember, which was not unusual for Lin Carter. But this one was fun, and it has this great Stranko cover, which does not really belong to this book. But there's that. I pulled that out for some reason. For some reason, I pulled that out. Hey, let's talk about some books that are a lot better than Callisto. Let's talk about some Fritz Leiber books. And I wanted to talk about this because this is a series I should have reread by now, and I haven't. This, of course, is the Fafford and the Grey Mouser series, which I am not sure why I have not reread. They're a fantastic series of fantasy stories, sword and sorcery stories, featuring Fafford, who is a big barbarian. He's kind of big Viking barbarian type. And the Grey Mouser, who is a little guy who is a thief. They are both incredible swordsmen. They're brilliant fighters with the sword. And they have a lot of fabulous adventures, and they have a really interesting relationship. It's an incredibly fun series of stories. And they were, as I recall, when they were first written, they weren't really written in order. But when Ace Books started printing the series, Fritz Leiber took the time to put all the stories in order, reworked some stuff for the publication of these stories. And the first book is Swords and Deviltry, the first book of Fafford and the Grey Mouser, featuring the Nebula award-winning story Ill Met in Lankmar, where our characters meet. But this book starts off with stories, an individual Grey Mouser story and an individual story of Fafford. So you kind of get their origin stories, if I'm remembering right. And then you have them meet up. And they become partners in sword and sorcery adventure. This series, I think they all have Jeff Jones covers, which are pretty cool. And this is the first one, Swords and Deviltry. That was followed by Swords Against Death, which has another really cool cover there for this Ace edition. Then we have Swords in the Mist. Swords in the Mist. Then Swords Against Wizardry. It's Swords Against Wizardry. The Swords of Lankmar. The Swords of Lankmar. And this goofy cover is like one of my favorites. I love this one. So yeah, The Swords of Lankmar is book 5. And this is the last I have with this jacket design or cover design. The next one is Swords and Ice Magic, which looks a little different in the paperback edition I have. Mine is cursed with a horrible sticker that will last for all time. It cannot be removed. But somebody, possibly myself, bought this for $1.75 at one point, because that's how much they're selling it for here. $1.75 on this old sticker. So yeah, Swords and Ice Magic. And for a long time, for about 10 years, I believe, this was the last book in the series of this fantastic duo. But Fritz Leiber kept writing stories about these two. And eventually we got another paperback book. And I think this is the last book in the series. Now, if I'm wrong, let me know. But I think The Knight and Knave of Swords is the last book in the series. It has a different cover artist. This artist it's Sweet, right? Yeah, Daryl Sweet does the artwork. And this was published in the 80s. Was it 1988? Let me see. Yeah, copyright 1988. And you know what? It's the 80s because Fafner has shaved his beard and gone to the stylist to give him this terrible 1980s mullet. So, he's really up to date. The Grey Mouser looks kind of badass, though. Look at the little Grey Mouser there. He's looking cool. Fafford, he's lost some of his 1970s style, I think, on this cover. It has a step back cover so you can get all the praise of Fritz Leiber, which is all deserved, from William Gibson, Harlan Ellison, Marion Zimmer Bradley. We won't hold that against Fritz Leiber. Brian Aldiss, and Roger Zelazny. Roger Zelazny, who says, I stop everything when the new Fafner and Gray Mouser story comes into my hands, which is high praise. You know, if Zelazny says this stuff is good, it's good. And these are great. This is a great series of sword and sorcery adventures. If you're interested in this subgenre, which is my favorite subgenre, these stories are essential. You really can't do without these. They are fantastic. They are written in a style which is unique to Fritz Leiber. He doesn't try to copy other writers as Lin Carter did. He did his own thing, and he did it extraordinarily well. Of course, he wrote a ton of different things. Fritz Leiber, he wrote a lot of science fiction. He wrote great horror stories. But it's probably this set of books, it's this set of stories that he'll be remembered for the most part. Probably, maybe. But they're certainly fantastic. And I'm not sure what editions these stories exist in now. I think there's a Fantasy Masterworks. I think there are 2 books from Fantasy Masterworks that have these stories, although I'm not even sure those are in print at the moment. So I don't know how many of these stories are still in print, but it's easy enough to find, I think, still these old paperback books, and I do highly recommend them. But that got me thinking of sword and sorcery, particularly sword and sorcery from the 1970s when these books came out, which of course made me think of Karl Edward Wagner. Karl Edward Wagner, who was fantastic. He wrote the Kane books. He's probably still best known for the Kane series of fantasy stories and novels. Kane, who is that Kane, the biblical Kane, who was cursed to walk the earth forever. And he was also a fantastic swordsman, and he was also a sorcerer, and he was an all-around villain. He is the main character of his stories, but I wouldn't even consider him an anti-hero, really. Kane is a villain. And so we have adventures of the villainous Kane, who occasionally does, he occasionally plays the role of a hero, but he's really a villain. And I have the Kane books in 2 hardcover collections. They were published by Nightshade, Nightshade Books. And this is the edition of the shorter stories of Kane. This is Midnight Sun, the complete stories of Kane. And this has I believe that's a Ken Kelly cover. And it's a nice wraparound cover. You know, you got the back there. And I believe this was the first time that these stories were ever published in a hardcover edition. There was a later hardcover edition of the Kane novels and stories, I believe, and those are very expensive. These are very expensive. The original paperbacks with the great Frank Frazetta covers are also very expensive. It is high time that the Kane stories were reprinted. I'm not sure why they haven't been. Karl Edward Wagner died a long time ago. He was unfortunately an alcoholic, and his alcoholism killed him at too young an age. But he was really cool. There he is there, Karl Edward Wagner. And these short stories of Kane, this incredibly dark character, it's just great stuff. Very dark. This is, people talk about grimdark and stuff like that in fantasy nowadays. This is the real thing. This is real dark fantasy right here. The Karl Edward Wagner's Kane stories. And I really love his stories. We've got a little map in this edition. Got to have the maps, so we have a really cool map. This does have all of the Kane stories. Some of the later Kane stories, because Kane is immortal, you see. And so we have a prehistoric civilization where Kane is basically wandering around for most of his stories. But there are some stories that were written in the 1980s, I believe, that have Kane in the modern world, where Kane is basically a drug dealer and criminal. I guess as he would be, because he's an all-around shady character. But those stories, which are basically horror stories, those are not nearly as good as the 1970s sword and sorcery stories of Kane. They're all included in here, but definitely the earlier stories are much better, I think. And of course, we have the novel. So this is the other book, Gods in Darkness, which has Bloodstone, Dark Crusade, and Darkness Weaves. The novels were fantastic. Bloodstone is probably my favorite, although Darkness Weaves is pretty great too. Dark Crusade, I actually don't remember much about. I haven't read that one probably since the mid 80s. I can't remember when I found a paperback of that. Actually, no, it was the 90s because I got a 90s reprint of that. That's where I read it. Even at the time, in between the 70s and the 90s, it could be hard to find some of the Kane stuff, Kane books in used bookstores. But then Bain Books, I believe, reprinted them all in paperback. And that's how I found Dark Crusade. But then I got these. I got these when they came out, before they were, enormously expensive. How much did this cost me? This cost me $35. They both cost $35. I don't know how much these are now, but it's more than $35. I'm pretty certain. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about some science fiction now. I love science fiction anthologies, so I thought I would pull out a science fiction anthology. And this is Before the Golden Age, which was put together by Isaac Asimov. This is a fantastic collection of science fiction from the pulp magazines in the 1930s. All chosen by Isaac Asimov, and really, you probably couldn't find anybody better suited to choose stories from this period than Isaac Asimov. There's young Isaac there. And this is really cool for a couple of different reasons. First of all, the selection of stories is wonderful. It's just a fantastic selection of stories. You've got, on the back cover here, you've got all the stories. So that's really cool. This is a book club edition of this. I don't think I've ever seen this except in a book club edition. But what makes this really interesting, just aside from the stories themselves, is that in between the stories, as introductions or afterwards to the stories, Isaac Asimov will write a little autobiographical piece telling you about where he was when these stories were published, where he was in life, what he thought of the stories. And so in between all of these stories, you have a bunch of Isaac Asimov stuff. And it's great. It's just great stuff. And it makes for a really interesting anthology. One of my favorites. So Before the Golden Age. I don't think I've read this since, again, this was probably the 80s. But I could be wrong. But it was probably the 80s when I read this book last, Before the Golden Age. It's one of those books, if you ever see it, buy it. If you like science fiction, I mean, this is just so great. If you're interested in science fiction or Isaac Asimov, definitely get it. It's worth looking up on eBay. I'm sure it's available. Probably it's not even that expensive. But it's wonderful. Before the Golden Age, Isaac Asimov. Highly recommend it. It's fantastic. So, there's that. Now, every week I talk about something Robert E. Howard. And I do have something to talk about. And this is because my good friend Grammaticus over at his fantastic channel, Grammaticus, you should all check out Grammaticus. I'll link his channel down below because he's awesome. He sent me this. The other day, Grammaticus made a whole video about this magazine. This is Cull and the Barbarians, which was a short-lived, it was very short-lived, I think it was 3 issues. It was a short-lived companion magazine to Savage Sword of Conan. And Conan was so successful, they're like, hey, let's make more stuff like that. And Marvel had its own line of black and white magazines. that were originally produced to compete against the Warren line of magazines, magazines like Creepy and Eerie and Vampirella. Most of Marvel's black and white magazines were horror magazines, and they were all fun. There were some great black and white magazines that came out. There was a science fiction one, which was wonderful. My favorite, other than Savage Sword of Conan, was the Planet of the Apes black and white magazine, which was magnificent and had just some great stuff in it. I actually did a whole video on that magazine because it was wonderful. But they put out this one, Cull and the Barbarians, which if you want an in-depth look at this, you should check out Grammaticus's video. But I did want to talk about a couple things about this magazine because it's interesting. So this magazine came out, and the idea behind this magazine is that it was going to be a magazine that featured the other heroes of Robert E. Howard, not just Cull, who is front and center on this fabulous cover. Not just Cull, but also some of the other characters that Robert E. Howard created, or sort of created in the case of Red Sonja. And you could see some of them here. You've got Solomon Kane. You've got Bran McMorn there. I'm pretty sure that's got to be Bran McMorn. You've got Red Sonja, who is based on Red Sonja, a Robert E. Howard's character. And then, of course, Cull and Brule the Spear Slayer. This is spread by Neil Adams here. This is a little introduction to this magazine. Now, as it says here in this story, in this little introductory article, when it came time to print this magazine, they weren't ready, which was pretty usual for Marvel. They had this on the schedule to print at this certain time. They had the cover and everything, but they didn't have the stories to put in the magazine. So they did a reprint book. This is a reprint book of stories that were published elsewhere. And you've got two Cull stories in it, of course. Two of the best Cull stories. A King Comes Riding here, which is basically part one of the Shadow Kingdom with some other stuff in it, which introduces the character of Cull to those unfamiliar with Cull. Part two is called The Shadow Kingdom. And that one starts right here. And this is wonderful because it's artwork by Murray and John Severn, who were just two of my very favorite artists of all time. And what a wonderful job they do on this Cull story. But it finishes up with another character and another one of Robert E. Howard's stories, which is The Valley of the Worm, which is a wonderful story. One of my favorite Robert E. Howard stories, Valley of the Worm. Some people think it's one of Robert E. Howard's best stories. It's up there. It's really, really good. So Valley of the Worm, which has a script by Roy Thomas and Jerry Conway, art by Gil Kane and Ernie Chow. So this is another reprint. Now, the original places where you could find these, I don't actually have the Cull stories. I do have this omnibus, though, which was printed by Marvel and is about to be, if it hasn't already been, reprinted by Heroic Signatures and Titan Books. But the original stories that you find in that magazine were originally published, the Cull stories were originally published in Cull the Conqueror in a color comic book. And if you're interested in seeing it in color, this omnibus is fantastic. So this is the place to find those first two stories in color. However, most of this magazine was also reprinted in another omnibus. So you had Cull the Savage, Cull the Savage. And what this has is all of the black and white stuff that was printed in Cull and the Barbarians and also in Savage Sword of Conan. On the back here, you have some different magazine covers. You have those 3 issues of Cull and the Barbarians. This has a wonderful article in the beginning that tells you the whole story. And then you have that wonderful cover reprinted. And you have most of the issue reprinted as well in this, as well as that original artwork by Neil Adams. You have the article there that I just showed you, and you have the black and white version of that story. Now, the second story, Valley of the Worm, was not reprinted in this. Only the Cull stories are reprinted in here, and some of that extra material. So I don't know that the Valley of the Worm has ever been reprinted again after Cull and the Barbarians. The first time it was printed was in a color comic book, this one. This is Supernatural Thrillers, which was a really fun comic book, actually, that reprinted horror and fantasy stories. And every issue would have a different story. And for issue number 3, we've got Valley of the Worm. And so originally this was a color comic book. For those of you who are curious about the differences between the look of the black and white magazine and the color comic book, here you go. This is how they each look. But it's awesome. This is an awesome story, and this is an awesome version of this story, an awesome adaptation. Now, like I said, I don't know if this story has ever been reprinted anywhere else other than these two places. Cull and the Barbarians, number 1, and Supernatural Thrillers, number 3. If it has been reprinted, let me know. Somebody out there knows. There's always somebody out there who knows more than I do. But this was fantastic. The original story has been reprinted recently in a book from the Edgar Rice Burroughs. I'm out to lunch today. It was reprinted in Swords of the North by Robert E. Howard from the Robert E. Howard Foundation Press, which came out fairly recently in paperback. So you can get the original story there, and I do highly recommend it. It's almost certainly in the public domain too, so you could probably just look it up online. But the comic book story, I don't know, but it's fantastic. And I should shut up now because I've talked long enough. I could just go on and on, so I'll be quiet. Okay, guys, we'll catch you next time.